There's something comforting in knowing that even the strangest beginnings can feel like home when told slowly, like a bedtime song. I want you to know, before we wander together, that you are cared for here, truly, softly, without condition. This story has been waiting a long time to find you, to rest in your ears, to settle in your chest like a quiet lantern. It isn't about battles or noise, but about small awakenings, odd friendships, and the way gentle hearts stretch across time. If you listen closely, you might hear echoes of your own childhood, shadows of wonder, whispers of memory. Wherever you are tonight, you belong here with us. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee, and let's get started. There are nights when dreams arrive not like strangers, but like family who have always been waiting. This is the story of such a night. A boy, not yet grown, stirred in the quiet of his small room, and when his eyes blinked open, he saw something resting on the wooden table beside his bed. A bottle, no bigger than his hand, but inside it shimmered a sky. Not painted glass, not illusion. A real sky folded into its narrow shape, with stars that pulsed like soft breathing. And from within, he heard a voice, the voice of his grandfather, long gone but somehow present, as if speaking through light itself. The boy did not move at first. He lay still, afraid that shifting might make the vision vanish. Yet the bottle remained, humming with a low sound, not loud but steady, like the hidden rhythm of the earth. His grandfather's words came through, warm and wavering, not entirely clear, but not entirely strange either. They said, "You are softer than the world, and that is your gift." He reached out with cautious fingers. The glass was cool, but not cold. He pressed his ear against it, as though it were a seashell, and listened to the hidden sea of stars inside. What he heard was not a story with beginning or end, but fragments, lullabies half remembered, a laugh that once filled their old garden, the creak of a rocking chair by the porch. The boy's chest filled with something that was not joy and not sorrow, but a mixture so tender that it made him close his eyes. No one else in the house stirred. His mother slept in the next room, his brother a floor below, but they knew nothing of this arrival. Only the boy, alone in the dark, kept watch over the sky contained in glass. He did not ask questions. He was too young to know the words for wonder, but old enough to feel it bloom like dawn inside him. He fell asleep holding the bottle, and in that sleep he dreamed of fields without edges. In the dream, his grandfather walked slowly through tall grass, not young, not old, but timeless. When the boy tried to call out, no sound came, but his grandfather turned anyway, smiling as if words were unnecessary. He lifted a finger to the air, pointing not at the boy but at the horizon, where the stars sank into earth like seeds. When morning came, the bottle was still there, its glow dimmer under daylight, but not gone. He carried it downstairs, careful not to drop it, and set it on the breakfast table. His mother, eyes still heavy with sleep, glanced at it and said only, "What an odd little jar," as if she saw only glass, no sky. His brother laughed and tapped it with a spoon, hearing nothing but the ring of emptiness. The boy said nothing. Some things were not meant to be explained. He kept the bottle with him through the days that followed. At school, it sat quietly in his satchel, pulsing faintly when no one was watching. On afternoons, when he sat alone in the swaying house that always leaned a little with the wind, he would take it out and rest it on his lap, listening. Sometimes the voice was clear, other times only a murmur, but always it carried something of comfort. Not answers, never instructions, only reminders. You are not lost. The small things matter. Gentle hands can shape even the roughest clay. Children his age did not understand why he carried it. They teased him, asked if he was keeping fireflies in glass or a drink he'd forgotten to finish. He smiled softly but said nothing. The bottle was not a secret, but it was not something that words could hold. At night the stars inside the glass grew brighter, as though they fed on silence. He would lie in bed, holding it above his face, watching the little constellations shift. Sometimes he thought he saw patterns, a bird with outstretched wings, a river curving endlessly, a figure bending forward as if in prayer. Perhaps they were only his imagination, Perhaps the sky inside reshaped itself to mirror his heart. Weeks passed. The boy grew used to the nightly conversations that were not quite conversations. He would whisper into the bottle, telling it things he could not tell anyone else. How sometimes he felt too soft for the world, too easily bent, too easily bruised. And in return the bottle would hum, releasing a warmth that spread from his palms into his chest, like invisible arms wrapping around him. One night, the voice of his grandfather was clearer than ever before. "Do not fear the way you bend," it said. "One day you will learn that bending is not weakness, but a way of holding what others cannot. You will stretch, not to escape, but to embrace." The boy did not fully understand, but he pressed the bottle to his forehead, letting the cool glass rest against his skin. Something about the words settled deep inside him, like seeds planted in soil that would one day bloom. As seasons shifted, the bottle remained unchanged. It did not gather dust, did not crack, did not fade. Always the same, always waiting. Sometimes he wondered if he had dreamed it into being, if it was nothing more than a trick of loneliness. But then the voice would return, soft as rain, reminding him of things he had not even known he remembered. The scent of bread baking in his grandmother's kitchen, the rough wool of his grandfather's coat against his cheek. These were not things he could invent. They were gifts given back to him. Years later, when he thought back to his childhood, he would remember many things: the swaying house, the laughter of his brother, the quiet fields beyond the village. But always, the beginning of his story would be the night the sky was given to him in a bottle, and the voice that told him he was not wrong to be soft in a world that often asked for hardness. And though he never said it aloud, he carried that truth within him, that even the strangest gifts can anchor us, that sometimes the stars choose not to live in the sky, but in the hands of children who need them most. The boy fell asleep many nights with the bottle pressed to his chest, its glow fading into his heartbeat, its hum settling into his dreams. And when he dreamed, he did not feel alone. He dreamed of the voice of the fields, of stars that bent close enough to be held. He dreamed of gentleness as power. He dreamed of beginnings that felt like home. The boy's home was never quite still. Other houses in the village stood firm, their beams set deep into the ground, their walls straight and proud. But his house leaned gently with the wind, as though it had roots instead of a foundation. Visitors sometimes laughed when they stepped inside, feeling the floor shift beneath their feet. They said it felt like standing on a boat, like the sea had somehow come ashore. But to the boy it was simply home. He learned from his earliest days that the world was not fixed. He learned to walk not with stiff steps, but with a rhythm that matched the swaying. His balance came not from standing tall, but from bending, adjusting, finding peace in movement. His mother would smile at him sometimes and say, "You have the house in your bones." She meant it kindly. At night, when storms blew across the fields, the walls would creak like old timbers on a ship. The boy would lie awake, bottle pressed to his chest, listening. Others might have been afraid, of collapse, of splintering wood, of the strange tilting. But he trusted the swaying. He knew the house had bent in the wind 1,000 times before, and each time it had survived by not resisting. It was in that house he learned the lesson that hardness breaks and softness endures. He learned that strength was not always about standing tall, but sometimes about yielding, bowing, letting the wind pass through. These were not things he thought about in words. They were lessons absorbed through the floorboards, through the rhythm of his footsteps, through the way his window frames rattled in a storm and yet held fast. There were days when his brother grew frustrated. "Why do we have to live in a crooked place?" he would grumble, trying to steady his books on the slanted desk. His mother would pat his shoulder and say, "Crooked things have their own kind of beauty." But the boy rarely complained. To him, the tilt and the sway were a lullaby, a reminder that even the ground could dance. He remembered one particular afternoon when a gusty wind swept across the valley. He sat at the window with the sky bottle in his lap, and as the walls leaned with the gusts, the stars inside the glass brightened as though stirred awake. He pressed his ear to it and heard the faint murmur of his grandfather's voice. "Let the wind pass through you. Be like grass. Be like water. You are not Here to resist the world but to move with it. The boy whispered back, "But won't I be broken if I'm too soft?" The voice did not answer with words, but the hum deepened, steady and warm, and he felt something inside him loosen, like a knot undone. Seasons passed. The swaying house became more than shelter. It was a teacher, quiet but constant. When neighbors repaired their own rigid homes after storms, the boy's house remained standing, creaking but whole. He began to understand why. Hard things cracked when pressed too far. His house endured because it leaned. And perhaps, he thought, people were not so different from houses. His mother often hummed while she worked, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm of the shifting floors. Sometimes she would sing a tune that had no words, only notes that seemed to echo the motion of their home. Long, low hums followed by soft lifts, like wind lifting grass and letting it fall again. The boy carried that melody with him, letting it blend with the murmurs from the bottle. Together they wove a song of softness, of survival. On summer nights, when the air was still and the house barely moved, he sometimes missed the sway. He would lie awake, waiting for the gentle rocking, the reminder that the world was alive around him. On those still nights, the bottle shone brighter, as if filling in what the house could not provide. He would whisper into it, telling it about the silence, about how he longed for the familiar tilt. And though no voice answered, he felt less alone for having spoken. One autumn morning, his brother invited him outside to play in the fields. The grass had grown tall, golden and dry, bending easily under the weight of the breeze. As the two of them ran, the boy noticed how the grass swayed just like the house, never breaking, always bending, flowing in unison. He stopped and stood still, watching the field ripple like a sea, and for the first time he thought, perhaps his house was not strange at all. Perhaps it was simply built to move like the earth itself. He said this to his brother, who only shrugged. "It's still crooked," the brother replied. But the boy smiled. He no longer felt the need to defend it. Some truths are not for argument, but for quiet knowing. Years later, when storms would rage louder and the swaying grew stronger, the boy's mother sometimes pressed her hands against the walls, as if steadying the whole house. Her face showed worry, but he did not share it. He knew the house's secret. He knew that it had survived not by fighting, but by yielding, and in that knowledge he found comfort. There was one night, however, when the wind grew so fierce that even he felt a flicker of fear. The house groaned louder than ever. The windows rattled as though they might break, and the floor rolled beneath his feet like a restless sea. He clutched the sky bottle to his chest and whispered, "Don't let it fall." The stars inside flared, glowing so brightly they filled the room with pale silver light. And through the storm's roar, he heard his grandfather's voice clearer than ever. "Trust the bending. Trust the sway. You were born in this house, and its song is in your bones." The boy closed his eyes. He let the floor shift beneath him, let the walls creak, let the storm howl. And slowly, his fear softened. He began to rock with the house, moving as it moved, his breath falling into rhythm. By the time the storm passed, he was asleep, still, holding the glowing bottle. When dawn came, the house leaned a little more than before, but it still stood. His brother groaned about crooked door frames, but the boy simply placed his hand on the wall and whispered, "Thank you." He meant it. In time, the swaying house would become part of his memory's landscape, as inseparable as his own heartbeat. He would not remember it as flawed, but as gentle, as wise. It taught him the quiet lesson he would carry forever, that to bend is not to break, and that sometimes the softest things endure the longest. And when he closed his eyes, he could still feel it, that gentle rocking like the earth itself had arms, cradling him into sleep. It began without warning in the quietest of moments. The boy was alone in the swaying house, the sky bottle resting on the windowsill where the fading sun touched it, scattering little starbursts on the wooden floor. He had been reaching for something, a book that had slipped beneath the cupboard, when his arm, instead of stopping where it should, kept going. He froze, half hidden beneath the furniture, staring at his own arm. It did not snap or break, but lengthened, stretching like soft clay drawn thin. He blinked, unsure if he was awake or still caught in some strange dream. Yet the sensation was not painful, not frightening. It felt, oddly, like water flowing, like the wind bending the grass outside. His fingers closed around the book easily, though it should have been out of reach. Slowly, cautiously, he pulled his arm back and it shortened again, returning to its familiar shape. He stared at it, flexing his hand, turning it palm up and palm down. Nothing seemed broken. Nothing seemed changed. And yet everything had shifted. He sat for a long while on the floor, bottle glowing faintly in the dusk, trying to name what had happened. But there were no words for it, no language taught in school or whispered by neighbors. The house creaked around him, as if acknowledging the discovery, rocking with a gentleness that steadied his breath. That night, he did not tell his mother or brother. Instead, he lay in bed with the bottle against his chest, whispering into the glass, asking what it meant. The hum inside deepened, warm and steady, and though no clear words came, he felt a reassurance. This is yours. It is not a curse. It is not a trick. It is simply you. In the days that followed, the stretching returned, always in small, unplanned ways. He reached a shelf too high for him, and his arm rose easily, lengthening just enough to pluck the jar his mother had placed there. He leaned to tie his shoes, and his fingers brushed the far wall before returning. At first it startled him, then slowly it became part of him, not a skill but a softness he could lean into. He noticed something else too. The stretching never came when he wanted it for himself. If he tried to reach further just for his own, Zaki, his body refused remaining ordinary. But when it was for others, to hand his brother a toy that had rolled under the bed, or to fetch his mother's clothespins from the high shelf, then it came easily, flowing without thought. It puzzled him but also comforted him. The stretching was not for pride, it was for care. And though he could not have explained why, he felt that was the truest kind of gift. One evening a neighbor came rushing to their house, worry in her voice. Her small child had dropped a toy into the narrow gap between their porch and the ground, a space too small for any adult arm to reach. The boy knelt, pressing his cheek to the dusty boards, and slid his hand into the dark. At first his fingers stopped, but then he thought of the child's worried face, and his arm flowed deeper, soft and long, until his fingertips brushed the toy. He pulled it free, handing it back with a shy smile. The mother gasped softly, not quite sure what she had seen. The boy's arm looked ordinary again, and she said nothing, only patted his head and whispered, "Thank you." But the child, too young for disbelief, simply laughed and hugged the toy tight, as if it were the most natural thing in the world for an arm to bend and stretch like wind. That night, the boy lay awake, staring at the stars outside his window. He whispered into the bottle, "It only happens when it's not for me. Why is that?" And for the first time he thought he understood the silence that followed. Perhaps it was not about why, but simply about how. His stretching was not meant for selfish reach. It was meant for kindness, for gathering, for giving. And that made sense to him, deep down in a way no answer could have explained. As weeks passed, he grew less afraid of it. He learned to trust the feeling that stirred in his chest when it was about to happen. A warmth, a tug, like the sway of the house itself moving through him. He never forced it. He only let it come, like breath, like sleep, like grace. Sometimes he practiced in secret, alone in his room. He would place an object just out of reach and then close his eyes, imagining someone else needing it. When he thought of another's need, the stretching flowed easily. But when he thought only of himself, nothing happened. This made him smile. It was a strange rule, but one that felt right. He began to see his body differently, not as something weak or too soft as he had once feared, but as something adaptable, made for bending rather than breaking. He remembered his grandfather's words from the bottle, "Do not fear the way you bend." Now he understood a little more. His softness was not flaw, it was form. One afternoon, as the sun set golden across the fields, he stood outside watching the tall grass bow in the breeze. He stretched his arms slowly, deliberately this time, letting it extend just enough to brush the tops of the grass, further than his body could reach. The movement felt natural, like joining in the dance. He did not laugh, did not shout. He only breathed in the moment, feeling the quiet wonder of it. His brother spotted him once, though, peeking through the doorway. "What are you doing?" he asked, eyes wide. "Just reaching," the boy said softly. "That's not normal," his brother whispered. "Maybe not," the boy replied, "but maybe it's still okay." His brother didn't argue, but neither did he join. He simply nodded, storing the memory away, unsure how to hold it. That night, when the boy lay in bed, the house swayed gently with the wind, and the bottle glowed faintly. He pressed it to his chest, closed his eyes, and whispered, "I think I'm beginning to understand." The hum deepened, as if in agreement. He drifted to sleep then, dreaming of arms that could reach not to grasp, but to gather. Arms that could wrap around sorrow, stretch across distance, soften the space between people. In his dream, he was not strange, not broken. He was exactly what he was meant to be, a child learning how to stretch into kindness. And when he woke, the morning light felt softer, as if the whole world had leaned a little closer, waiting for him to rise. The first time it happened, it was an ordinary afternoon, one of those slow, golden hours when the air was heavy with the smell of baking bread. His mother had left a fresh loaf on the counter, steam curling upward like a soft signal of comfort. The boy, hungry from play, sliced off a piece, laid cheese upon it, and carried it to the table. He ate slowly, savoring each bite. Yet when the last crumb should have disappeared, he found another piece waiting in his hand. He blinked, certain he had finished it, but there it was, whole again. He chewed once more, tasted the same warmth, and still, after swallowing, the bread returned unbroken, unending. At first he thought he was dreaming. He set the sandwich down, looked away, then back again. It sat there, plain and simple, not glowing, not shifting, only waiting. Tentatively, he took another bite. Once again, it restored itself, like the air itself wished never to let him go hungry. He laughed softly, startled by the gentleness of the gift. It was not like the stretching, not bound by effort or intention. This was a miracle of abundance, quiet and calm. He kept eating, but never grew full in the heavy, uncomfortable way. Instead, each bite filled him with warmth, just enough, like a lullaby sung directly to his stomach. When his brother came bounding in, he offered him a slice. His brother devoured it quickly, then reached for the empty plate and blinked. The sandwich was still there. His eyes widened. "Did you make two?" The boy shook his head. "Just one." His brother stared at him, then at the bread, then back again. Slowly a grin spread across his face. "Do it again." "I didn't do anything," the boy replied, but still he handed him the sandwich. His brother ate another, and each time it returned, unending, unchanged. Soon they were both laughing, crumbs scattering across the table, joy spilling out like sunlight. Their mother, hearing the noise, entered and frowned gently. "What's all this mess?" she asked. The boys froze, holding the miraculous sandwich between them. But when she looked, she saw only an ordinary loaf of bread, one that shrank properly with each slice. She shook her head, muttering about appetites, and returned to her work. The boys exchanged a glance. They said nothing, but from then on, the sandwich became their secret. Over the weeks that followed, the boy carried the bread with him, tucking it into cloth, placing it in his satchel. Whenever he or someone near him grew hungry, he would break it open, and always there was enough. Enough for his brother after long play, enough for his mother when she returned weary from work, enough for neighbors who happened to stop by. One afternoon, an old man passing through the village paused outside their swaying house. His face was lined, his eyes tired. The boy felt something stir in his chest, the same warmth that often preceded his stretching. Without thinking, he fetched the sandwich, offered it with both hands. The man accepted it, chewing slowly, tears gathering in his eyes. "I haven't tasted bread like this in years," he whispered, and though the boy said nothing, he felt a deep, quiet gladness settle inside him. The sandwich never boasted, never demanded recognition. It simply offered itself again and again, as if its only desire was to feed. The boy began to think of it not as bread, but as a kind of companion, one that taught him that giving did not diminish, but multiplied. Sometimes, late at night, he would place the sandwich beside the sky bottle on his table. The stars glowed faintly in the glass. The bread sat plain on the cloth, and together they seemed to hold a secret harmony, one offering memory, the other sustenance. He whispered to the bottle about the bread's strange gift, and though no words returned, the hum deepened as though approving. He began to notice something subtle. The sandwich worked best when shared. If he tried to eat it alone, it still restored itself, but the taste grew plain, almost dull. Yet when eaten with another, his brother, his mother, a neighbor, even a passing bird that pecked a crumb, it was rich, almost luminous. He came to understand that the bread was not truly endless for his sake alone, but for the circle of giving it created. Once, during a long afternoon of rain, he sat with his brother by the window, breaking the bread in halves, over and over. The rhythm of it became like play, like music. Break, give, eat, laugh. Break, give, eat, laugh. The rain drummed outside. The house swayed gently, and inside there was no hunger, no emptiness, only fullness that did not weigh down, but lifted. The boy thought often of his grandfather's voice from the bottle. Gentle hands can shape even the roughest clay. Perhaps gentle hands could also shape abundance. Perhaps this was the meaning hidden in the sandwich, that generosity itself could be endless if only one kept sharing. He carried this truth quietly, not as a grand revelation, but as a simple rhythm like breathing. When someone near him looked tired, he offered the bread. When laughter was fading, he broke it open. When silence pressed too heavy, he handed it across. And each time the miracle repeated, unshowy, unending. There was never a day when the sandwich ran out, yet somehow he never tired of it. Each bite was slightly different, sometimes warm like fresh baking, sometimes cool like morning air, sometimes carrying a faint sweetness, sometimes a nutty strength. It was as though the bread listened to the hunger of the moment and answered, in kind. Years later, when he would think back to childhood, he would not remember the sandwich as a trick of magic or a miracle to boast of. He would remember it as the taste of enough, the quiet satisfaction of never fearing emptiness, the comfort of sharing without cost. And though he never told many people about it, he carried the lesson in his heart that some gifts are not meant to dazzle but to nourish quietly, endlessly, like bread that never runs out. That night, as he drifted into sleep with crumbs still on his fingertips, the swaying house rocked him gently, the bottle glowed softly, and the sandwich, resting on its cloth, waited patiently for tomorrow's hunger. He dreamed not of feasts or banquets, but of small tables, of shared laughter, of hands reaching across to offer just enough. And in that dream, he understood. Abundance is not in what we keep, but in what we give away. The sky had always been a place of comfort for the boy. He liked to lie in the grass outside the swaying house, the bottle resting against his chest, the sandwich tucked safely in cloth beside him. The world felt quieter when he looked upward. Clouds drifted slowly across the wide blue, changing shape with each passing breeze. Some looked like animals, some like boats, some like nothing at all. Yet to him, they never felt empty. They carried something more. One afternoon, while the air was still and warm, he closed his eyes and let himself drift into half-sleep. The grass brushed his cheeks, the earth hummed beneath him, and overhead the clouds gathered in loose, pale clusters. As he lay there, he heard something soft. Not quite a voice, not quite a song, but a murmur threaded through the air. He opened his eyes and the clouds shifted, curling in a way that seemed deliberate, almost like lips forming words. He sat up slowly, holding his breath. The sound was faint, fragile, almost like the sigh of distant wind through reeds. But then it came clearer, as if tuned directly to him. We remember. We remember. The boy blinked, his heart swelling. Remember what? He whispered. The clouds billowed and parted, their edges glowing in the sun. Again the breathy murmur. We remember dreams. He did not know what that meant, not fully, but something inside him leaned toward it, as though he'd been waiting to hear it all along. He lay back down, letting the whispers roll over him. soft, as lullabies. From that day forward he returned often to the field. Some days the clouds said nothing, only floated lazily as clouds are expected to. Other days he caught fragments, single words, short phrases, echoes of half-forgotten songs. They did not sound like commands or warnings. They sounded like memories, old and fragile, slipping through from another place. He began to keep a small notebook, scribbling down the whispers he thought he heard. Seeds carried by wind, a child's laugh under rain, hands that held and let go, the hush of snow before dawn. They were not stories, not lessons, but pieces. Still, the boy treasured them as if they were secret gifts. One afternoon, while he was listening to the sky, an older man from the village stopped by. He was known for his quiet wisdom, though he spoke rarely, preferring to listen. He saw the boy lying in the grass and asked gently, "What do you hear up there?" The boy hesitated, unsure if he should tell the truth. But the man's eyes were kind, so he whispered, "The clouds, they speak sometimes." The man nodded slowly, as though this was no surprise. "Ah, you're listening closely then. Most people don't." He lowered himself onto the grass beside the boy, his joints stiff but his movements patient. For a while they both stared upward. The clouds drifted, curling into new shapes. The boy held his breath, waiting. Then faintly, the murmurs began again. "We remember." Footsteps, softer than snow. The boy turned to the man, wide-eyed. "Did you hear it too?" The man closed his eyes, smiling faintly. "Not with ears, but I've always believed clouds are the keepers of forgotten dreams. They drift from person to person, carrying what we've let slip away." The boy felt a quiet awe settle in him. "Why would they tell me?" "Because you listen," the man said simply. "Most people only look at clouds. Few truly listen." From then on, the boy thought of the man as a kind of mentor, though no formal lessons were ever given. They would lie in the grass together, sometimes in silence, sometimes trading the phrases they thought they heard. The man taught him to close his eyes and breathe with the sky, to let his heart open as though it were another ear. "Dreams," he said once, "are just the soul's way of remembering what the mind forgets. And clouds, they carry the leftovers." The boy liked that thought. It made the world feel stitched together, nothing wasted, nothing lost. There were days when the whispers seemed to speak directly to him, soothing his quiet worries. Once, when he feared he might never understand his strange stretching or his endless sandwich, the clouds murmured, "You are not broken, you are a bridge." He wrote it down carefully, circling it in his notebook, reading it over and over until it became part of him. Another day, as he lay with the mentor beside him, the sky whispered, "Every kindness is remembered, even when forgotten." The boy felt tears prick his eyes, though he didn't know why. The man squeezed his shoulder gently as though to say yes, let it in. Sometimes the whispers grew faint, almost inaudible, and he wondered if he had imagined them. But then a phrase would arrive with sudden clarity, like a bell rung in the sky, and he knew they were real in the only way that mattered, real to his heart. He never told his brother or mother about the clouds. Some gifts, he sensed, were not meant to be explained. They were to be experienced, cherished quietly, like a secret between himself and the sky. One evening, as the sun set and the clouds burned gold and crimson, he whispered up to them, "Do you remember me?" For a long moment there was only silence. Then the clouds thinned, parting slightly, and in the soft dusk the murmurs came, "We do, we will." The boy closed his eyes, pressing the sky bottle to his chest, feeling its hum blend with the whispers above. Between the glowing glass and the murmuring clouds, he felt surrounded by memory, by love, too vast to explain. That night, his dreams were filled with voices, not loud, not frightening, but gentle and overlapping, like 100 lullabies sung in a language beyond words. He woke with tears on his cheeks, not of sorrow, but of something deeper, something that felt like being held. From then on, whenever loneliness brushed against him, he would step outside, look to the sky, and listen. And more often than not, the clouds answered, reminding him that nothing gentle is ever truly lost, only carried onward in whispers. She was always there before he noticed her. Not suddenly, not startling, but quietly, as if she had been sitting for hours and only then decided to be seen. A girl from the village, small and pale with dark hair that fell into her eyes. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her words were soft as moth wings, fragile and few. He first saw her by the river, her bare feet dangling over the edge, toes skimming the slow water. She didn't look at him when he came near. She simply shifted, slightly, leaving space beside her, as if she had expected him all along. He sat down without asking, bottle clutched in his hand, notebook resting on his lap. Together they watched the current carry leaves and petals downstream. The silence stretched, but it was not empty. It was full of things unspoken, patience, curiosity, a strange sense of safety. Finally, after what felt like a long time, she said quietly, "You listen to the sky." He turned, startled. No one had ever said it so directly. "How did you know?" She shrugged, brushing hair from her face. "You look up different than other people. Like you're waiting for an answer." The boy's cheeks warmed. He wasn't sure what to say, so he said nothing. And she seemed to like that answer better than words. From then on, she began to appear in his days. Sometimes at the river, sometimes in the field where he lay listening to the clouds. She would sit nearby, knees tucked to her chest, silent but not absent. He grew used to her presence, the way her stillness softened the air around them. It was not that she disliked speaking. It was that she didn't need to. Where others filled the world with chatter, she filled it with attention. When he stretched his arm absent-mindedly to pluck a branch high above, she didn't gasp or ask questions. She only watched, eyes wide, but calm, as if she had always known he could do such things. One day he asked, "Don't you want to know why I'm like this?" He stretched a hand gently, fingers bending like ribbon. She shook her head. "I don't need to know. I just need to see." Those words stayed with him, heavier than any explanation could have been. She didn't need reasons. She accepted him as he was without demand. Over time, their silence grew richer. They learned to speak without speaking. A small glance could mean, "I'm glad you're here." A sigh could mean, "I understand." When the clouds whispered overhead, he sometimes shared the phrases he heard, and she would nod as though she had heard them too, even if she hadn't. Her quiet was never distance. It was closeness of another kind. Once in the meadow, as fireflies blinked against the twilight, she finally spoke a little more. "When I was younger, I used to dream I was invisible, not in a sad way, just that no one noticed me, and I could move through the world without being touched." The boy tilted his head. "Did you like it?" She thought for a while, then whispered, "Sometimes, but sometimes I wanted someone to notice, even if I stayed quiet." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached down, stretched his arm, gently until his hand brushed hers. He didn't grip tightly, only let it rest there, warm and certain. She glanced at him once, her lips almost curving into a smile, and that was enough. They shared small rituals. At the river, they would drop stones and watch the ripples overlap. In the meadow, they would lie back to back, listening to the grass shift. She began to hum sometimes, low, tuneless sounds that wove through the silence without breaking it. He found himself stretching more comfortably in her presence, as though her acceptance made him softer, more himself. The villagers noticed them together, but never intruded. Some whispered that the boy was strange, that the girl was stranger still, but neither of them cared. Their friendship was not built to be explained to others. It was built to be felt, moment by moment, without question. One evening, as dusk deepened, into night, the boy showed her the sky bottle. He had never shared it with anyone else. He held it out, the stars inside flickering faintly. Her eyes widened, not with shock, but with reverence. She touched the glass gently, fingertips trembling. "It sounds like someone you miss," she whispered. His throat tightened. He had never said aloud that the bottle carried his grandfather's voice, but she seemed to know without needing to be told. He nodded, and together they held it, the faint hum vibrating between them. She closed her eyes and pressed her forehead against the bottle. For a moment she seemed to be listening too, not to the words but to the feeling, the memory carried in the light. When she opened her eyes, she whispered, "He's still here." Not gone, just softer. The boy swallowed, tears burning quietly. She didn't wipe them away or offer comfort in the usual way. She only sat there, steady and present, her silence stronger than any words. And somehow, it healed more deeply than comfort ever could. As the seasons shifted, their companionship became a rhythm, like breathing, like waves. Sometimes they spoke, often they didn't, but always they understood. Years later, when he thought back on his childhood, he would remember her most vividly, not by what she said, but by the way she waited, patient, unwavering, content to sit in silence until he was ready to share. She taught him that presence was its own kind of language, just as true as whispers from the sky or voices in bottles. He once wrote in his notebook, "She did not always understand my words, but she always understood my heart." And that, he realized, was the rarest gift of all. The boy had always known the river as a companion. Long before he understood its moods, he had felt its quiet pull, the way it bent around stones, the way it shimmered under moonlight, the way it seemed to breathe alongside him. It was not just water, not only current and depth. It was a listener, patient and old. He would often sit by its edge with the silent girl nearby, her feet brushing the surface, while he dangled a stick into the water and traced gentle circles. The river never hurried him. It received whatever he gave, a leaf, a sigh, a thought he was too shy to say aloud. And sometimes, just sometimes, it seemed to answer. One summer afternoon, heavy with heat, he leaned close to the water. His reflection wavered in the ripples, stretched and blurred. He whispered, "Do you hear me?" The river gave no words, but a small swirl formed near his hand, as though the current had paused just to notice. He blinked, unsure if he had imagined it. "Gee." Girl, sitting close, tilted her head and whispered. It listened. She said it so simply, so certain that he believed her. From then on he began to speak more openly to the river, not loudly but in murmurs, as though confessing secrets into the air. He told it of the bottle filled with stars, of the clouds that whispered his name, of the strangeness of stretching his limbs until they brushed impossible branches. The river held his words without judgment, carrying them downstream into silence. One evening, after a long day, he came to the bank in tears. Something in him felt heavy, though he couldn't name it, a loneliness that pressed against his chest. He sat and bent forward, his arms stretching, wrapping around his knees. He let the tears fall, dropping into the current below. To his surprise, the river softened. The rushing noise quieted, as though the water hushed itself for him. The ripples calmed, smoothing into stillness. It was as if the river had leaned closer, listening with all its surface. His breathing slowed, drawn into the rhythm of the water. And for the first time he realized that the river was not only a listener, it was an echo. When he smiled faintly, the water brightened, catching the sunlight like laughter. When he wept, it slowed, like a hand resting gently on his shoulder. His emotions and the river's movements seemed bound, inseparable, each shaping the other. He began to experiment in small, tender ways. If he closed his eyes and thought of peace, the ripples softened. If he hummed a tune his grandfather once sang, the water seemed to carry the melody downstream, repeating it faintly against the stones. The river was not a mirror. It was a companion, translating heart into current, turning feeling into flow. The girl noticed it too. One afternoon, when he calmed the water after a storm, she whispered, "Your heart is like gravity. Even the river leans toward it." He laughed softly, embarrassed, but he knew she was right. This gift did not make him proud. Instead, it made him careful. He realized how closely the world could respond to tenderness or sorrow. He learned to breathe slower, to carry himself with gentleness, because even water could bruise if pressed too harshly. Seasons folded quietly, as they always did. Autumn scattered leaves across the surface, and he stretched his arms long to scoop them into patterns. Winter froze the edges, and he sat with the girl, listening to the river's muffled heartbeat beneath the ice. Spring returned the voice of rushing water, quick and alive, and he whispered greetings like to an old friend. But the moment he remembered most clearly came one dusk, as lanterns from the village glowed in the distance. He sat alone that evening, the girl gone home early. The sky deepened to violet and the first star appeared. He leaned over the water and whispered, "I don't want to be alone." The river did not speak, but in its patient way, it stilled, perfectly quietly, as though to say, "You are not," and he believed it. He felt the weight in his chest soften, replaced by a calm he couldn't explain. It was not the absence of loneliness, but the presence of something larger, a listening so vast that it made space for him to rest. Years later, when he thought back on his strange childhood, he would tell himself that the river taught him the most important truth of all, that emotions were not meant to be hidden away like secrets. They could be released, carried, shared. They could bend the world as gently as water bends around stone. He wrote in his notebook one night, "The river listens back. Not with words, not with answers, but with silence that knows me." And that is enough. And from then on he carried that knowing wherever he went, like a current flowing quietly beneath his every step. The Lantern Festival came once each year, yet to the boy it always felt like stepping into a dream. The whole village gathered by the water's edge, their hands full of light, their voices hushed as if they were all standing inside a single, shared heartbeat. He remembered his grandfather once saying, "Lanterns are wishes made visible." That thought stayed with him as he walked alongside the silent girl and the other villagers, each carrying their small glowing vessel. The evening smelled of warm rice and smoke, and the air shimmered with anticipation. The boy's lantern was simple, its paper sides thin enough for the flame inside to shine through like soft skin. He stretched his fingers to touch its surface, careful not to tear it. The girl held hers close to her chest, her face lit golden, her silence somehow louder, under the glow. When the signal came, the people knelt at the riverbank. One by one, lanterns touched the water, swaying, trembling, then floating free. Light spilled across the current like stars set loose from the sky. The boy lowered his lantern gently, stretching his arm farther than most so the flame would drift, quickly into the center. He whispered a wish, not for himself but for kindness to find the ones who needed it. The river, as it always did, listened. The lanterns spread slowly, their reflections doubled, trembling stars above and below. And something in that quiet sight made time itself seem to hesitate, as though the world wanted to savor the moment, just as much as they did. The boy noticed it first in the way the lanterns drifted, not fast, not hurried, but gliding, as if the current had softened its pace. The air, too, seemed to breathe more slowly. Voices grew distant, stretched, blurred, until laughter sounded like an echo from far away. Even his own heartbeat slowed, thudding deep and measured. "Is it me?" he asked softly. "Or is everything slower tonight?" The girl only nodded, her lantern glowing faint in the distance. Her silence, as always, was an answer more eloquent than words. The boy stretched his arms, brushing the surface of the water. Ripples moved outward, but not in the quick way ripples should. They expanded gracefully, lingering as if reluctant to fade. He watched, entranced. Perhaps it was the river again, shaping itself to his feelings, giving him time to hold this sight longer. He turned to the girl. "If this moment stayed forever, would you be content?" She gazed at the water, eyes reflecting dozens of lanterns. "Some things should last," she whispered at last, "even if only in memory." Her words lingered, and the boy knew she was right. Time could not truly pause, but memory could cradle what time released. The night carried on, though every sound and movement remained slow, softened, dreamlike. The boy saw families standing together, hands joined as lanterns floated. He saw old men nodding, eyes glassy with tears they didn't hide. He saw children pointing to the glowing river, their laughter stretched into long ribbons of joy. The boy and the girl stayed by the bank long after others left. Lanterns drifted further downstream, tiny sparks vanishing into distance. He stretched his arm far into the current and held it there, as if to keep the river tethered, as if to keep the light from escaping too soon. The girl leaned against his shoulder, She said nothing, but her presence was steady, her silence full of trust. Together they watched until the last lantern dimmed, its glow swallowed by the horizon. Only then did time resume its usual rhythm. A small breeze brushed their cheeks, the water lapped softly again, and the world returned to its ordinary pace. The boy breathed deeply. It felt like forever. The girl nodded, her eyes half closed. Sometimes forever fits inside a single night. Those words nestled into him, sinking deep, becoming part of the quiet truth he carried. He understood now. It wasn't about holding on to moments forever, but about allowing them to stretch wide enough to feel endless while they lasted. As they walked home, the boy thought of how his powers had always been about stretching, not just his limbs, but moments, kindness, silence. He realized that perhaps this was the true gift, to make ordinary things feel spacious, to let love and light linger longer than they should. That night, when he lay down to sleep, the image of lanterns on water returned again and again, as if the river inside him had kept them glowing. He whispered a thank you to the night itself, then drifted into dreams where lanterns floated not on rivers, but on clouds, drifting slowly, endlessly, never going out. He did not speak of his brother often, though the memory of him lingered like the aftertaste of honey, sweet, but tinged with something that could not quite be named. His brother had been older, steadier, and less curious about odd things. While the boy spent afternoons watching clouds shift into voices, or stretching his arms to calm the restless river, his brother preferred the certainty of soil, tools, and the rhythm of work. One reached outward towards strangeness, the other rooted himself in the earth. They grew side by side in the swaying house, their beds separated by a curtain of fabric that shifted with the wind. At night the boy would whisper questions. Do you think the stars have their own names? Do rivers remember where they've been? And his brother would chuckle softly, answering with silence or the simplest reply, sleep, before the night grows older than us. Yet even in his quiet dismissal there was warmth. His brother never mocked him, never tore down his wonder. Instead he anchored it, like a weight that kept a drifting kite from flying too far. As they aged, paths began to diverge. The boy's oddness only deepened, his stretching, his whispers, to the river, his listening to clouds. The villagers began to look at him with both curiosity and distance. His brother, meanwhile, became part of the village's everyday rhythm, planting in spring, repairing roofs before rain, offering strong shoulders when others faltered. And so the boy felt both gratitude and ache. Gratitude because his brother made sure Noon spoke unkindly of him. Ache because he knew his brother's life was not filled with lanterns and whispered dreams, but with tasks that left little room for wonder. The night of their parting came quietly. The boy had decided to wander, not out of rebellion, but because something in his chest told him he must see where the river led. His brother stood by the doorway of the leaning house, arms crossed, lantern light flickering across his face. "You'll come back?" the brother asked, not as a demand, but as a hope. The boy nodded. "I'll return, but I don't know when." His brother sighed, then rested a hand on his shoulder. The weight of it was steady, grounding. "Go then. Some of those are meant to stay. Some are meant to follow rivers. Just don't forget the way home." The boy promised he would not. And yet, even as he promised, he felt the truth. That journeys change people, and sometimes the return is never quite the same as the leaving. In the years that followed, whenever the boy, now grown, stretched his arms into impossible distances, whenever he quieted waters or listened to clouds, he thought of his brother. He wondered if, in staying behind, his brother had lived a fuller life than he could ever know. Planting, tending, raising, loving within the small circle of the village. The boy imagined him standing in fields, the sun warm on his back, his laughter shared with neighbors. He imagined him repairing the swaying beams of the old house, making it sturdy for the next storm. He imagined him aging slowly, steadily, his roots sinking deeper while the boy drifted further. And yet, in the silence of night, there was always the ache. For every river the boy calmed, for every lantern he stretched toward the current, there was a brother-shaped absence at his side. Still, absence was not emptiness. It was presence remembered. The boy carried it like a quiet stone in his chest, weighty but grounding, reminding him of where he came from, of the soil that once held his roots too. Years later, when he returned briefly to the village, the field seemed smaller, the swaying house older, but his brother stood there broad-shouldered and smiling faintly. They embraced wordless, the kind of embrace that carried years within it. No need for explanations, no need for apologies. The brother said only, "You came back." And the boy, who was no longer quite a boy, yet still carried wonder in his bones, replied, "I never really left." They walked together through the familiar paths, and the boy saw that though his brother had stayed, he too had traveled, not through rivers or lanterns, but through seasons, through love, through the quiet resilience of an anchored life. That night, lying once again in the swaying house, the boy listened for his brother's breath through the curtain of fabric. It was slower now, heavier, but still steady. He closed his eyes and thought, some journeys are measured not in distance, but in the way a heart chooses to stay. And with that thought he drifted into sleep, comforted by the knowledge that though their paths were different, they were still bound, one by roots, one by rivers, both by love. He had not expected the mentor to leave so soon. It happened quietly, as many departures do, not with a breaking, but with a soft loosening like a rope slipping free from a post. The mentor had arrived years before, carried by whispers in the clouds and stories that spoke of a traveler who understood the secret languages of dreams. She was older than the boy by many years, yet she carried herself with a gentleness that made her presence feel less like authority and more like shelter. It was she who had first told him that stretching was more than a quirk of the body. "It's not about distance," she said one evening, her voice calm as the dusk. "It's about making room for others, for silence, for things that cannot fit inside ordinary space." He had listened wide-eyed, his arms stretching idly toward the stars, as if trying to catch her meaning. Years passed, and the mentor became a constant thread in his life. She taught him not only to hear the river's moods, but to hear his own. She showed him how to listen without hurry, how to sit with questions that did not need answers. Sometimes she spoke of her own journeys, places where sand turned to glass under the sun, or towns where bells rang not to mark hours, but to remind people to pause and breathe. The boy, now older, absorbed her lessons like roots drinking rain. Yet he also noticed her silences growing longer, her body slower, her gaze drifting more often to distant horizons, as though following invisible threads of memory. One evening, under a pale sky where no stars yet showed, she called him to walk with her by the river. The current moved lazily, carrying a few early autumn leaves. She leaned on her staff, her steps measured. "You've learned more than I could ever teach," she said, her voice soft as falling dusk. "The rest of the path is yours to walk without me guiding each step." The boy frowned. "Are you leaving?" The mentor smiled faintly, lines deepening around her eyes. "Everyone leaves in time. Some with noise, some with silence. I prefer the silence." He felt a tightness in his chest, a stretching that no amount of bending could ease. "But I'm not ready." She touched his shoulder. Her hand was light but steady. "You'll never feel ready. That is how we know it matters." They stopped at the place where the river curved widest, where years ago he had first discovered that his emotions could soothe the water's unrest. The mentor lowered herself to a flat stone and gestured for him to sit. "For me," she said, gazing at the slow water, "this river has always been a teacher. It reminds us that everything moves and that stillness is not the absence of flow, but the deep listening beneath it." The boy tried to memorize her face, her voice, the exact cadence of her words. Already he could feel them slipping into memory, even before she was gone. "Will I see you again?" he asked. Her smile held both warmth and distance. "Perhaps, but if you don't, you will still carry me. My words, my silences, even the way you hold your arms when you stretch, all of it will be echoes of me long after I've gone." A hush fell between them, the kind of silence that carried more comfort than speech. The boy leaned back, listening, to the river, feeling it mirror the slow ache in his heart. When the time came, she rose, pressing her staff into his hands. "This belongs to you now. Not because you need support, but because reminders are important. A staff is less about walking and more about remembering where you've walked. He took it with trembling fingers. "Thank you," he whispered. She nodded once, then began to walk away along the riverbank. Her figure grew smaller, framed by the fading light, until she seemed less like a person and more like part of the evening itself. The boy did not call after her. He understood her wish for silence, for partings that did not tear but faded like dusk into night. When she was gone, he sat by the water for a long while, holding the staff, letting the ache inside him soften. The river seemed to hum gently, as though promising him that absence was not an ending, only a change of form. That night he dreamed of her voice carried inside the sky bottle, mingling with his grandfather's. They did not speak in words, but in lullabies of wind and water. He woke with tears on his face, but also with a strange peace, the kind that settles after the hardest storms. From then on, whenever he calmed a river or listened to a whisper in the clouds, he felt her near, not as a figure beside him, but as a quiet presence within. And in that way the farewell was never final. It became instead another kind of closeness, one not bound by sight or touch, but by memory and love. He found the village on a night when the moon was thin and silver, and the road seemed to hum with a quiet it had never carried before. The air was still, as though it were holding its breath, and the boy, now older, his shoulders a little more shaped by years, walked with the staff his mentor had left him. Each step felt measured, as if the ground itself were guiding him toward something he could not yet name. The village revealed itself not with noise but with silence. Houses stood with their doors ajar, candles burning faintly in windows. And the people drifted through the streets with eyes closed, moving slowly, as if guided by a rhythm hidden beneath the world. At first, he thought them ghosts, but as he drew nearer, he saw the soft rise and fall of their breathing, the gentle sway of their arms as they walked, their lips parting now and then to murmur words no waking ear could fully understand. He stood still, staff in hand, and simply watched. A woman passed by, her face tilted slightly upward as though dreaming of the stars. A child padded barefoot down the lane, a small smile lingering as if he were following some secret joy. None of them stumbled, none collided. It was as though they shared a map, invisible to waking eyes, each dreamer guided by the currents of sleep. The boy felt something stir in his chest, not fear, but a hushed awe. The world was stranger, softer than he had ever imagined, and in this strangeness he felt at home. He walked quietly among them, his own steps slow and careful, as if afraid to break the spell. Some brushed past him without noticing, their skin cool and light, as though they were made of moonlight itself. He whispered, "Do you see me?" But no one answered. Their silence was not rejection, but a kind of music, steady and deep. At the center of the village stood a fountain, its water trickling gently into a round stone basin. Around it, several villagers circled, eyes closed, their steps perfectly timed with the sound of the falling water. He leaned on his staff and listened. The trickle of water seemed to blend with the faint hum of their breaths, creating a rhythm that lulled his body into calm. He sat at the edge of the fountain, dipping his fingers into the cool stream. And when he did, the villagers slowed. Their pace softened, and some turned their heads slightly as if they could feel him even if they could not see him. It was then he understood. They were not lost. They were not trapped. They were in between, half in dreams, half in waking, and the village itself had learned to cradle them there, like a hand cupping fragile light. One villager, a man with hair the color of ash, stopped before him. Though his eyes remained closed, his lips parted. "You carry a river in your heart," he whispered, his voice soft, almost breaking. Then he moved on, swaying gently back into the circle around the fountain. The boy's breath caught. He touched his chest, wondering how the man could have known. Perhaps in this village dreams saw more than waking ever could. He stayed the night, not in a bed, not behind a door, but seated by the fountain, listening to the villagers drift in their silent patterns. The moon arched high, then fell toward the horizon, and still they walked. He began to notice the motifs in their murmurs, the way some repeated fragments of songs, Others whispered names, and others simply sighed, as though releasing burdens they could not carry awake. When dawn came, the first rays of light spilled across the rooftops, and one by one, the villagers slowed. Their murmurs faded, their steps faltered, and gently they sank to the ground, curling like children at rest. They did not wake. They simply slept, this time fully, as though the night had been only a passage into deeper rest. The boy rose, stretching his arms not out of need, but as a blessing over them. He felt no urgency to wake them, no desire to disrupt their rhythm. Some worlds, he thought, are meant to be observed, not changed. Before leaving, he placed his staff across his knees and whispered into the fountain, as if speaking to the village itself. "Thank you for showing me what balance looks like, how one can walk even while dreaming, how one can dream even while walking." The water rippled in response, and he imagined the village heard him. When he stepped beyond its edges, the world brightened, and the silence behind him folded back into distance. Yet he carried something from that night, a gentler pace, a willingness to drift between thoughts instead of clinging to them. For years afterward, when sleep came slowly to him, he would remember the village of sleepwalkers. He would picture their quiet procession, their murmured songs, their surrender to rhythm, and in those memories he too would drift into rest, walking softly in dreams, never fully lost. He found the garden in a quiet hollow, where the air seemed softer than the rest of the world, and the grass grew thick as if it had never known haste. The path toward it was narrow, overgrown with vines that brushed his sleeves like welcoming hands. He walked slowly, listening to the hush of leaves until the trees parted, and there it was, a place unlike any he had seen before. At first it seemed like any meadow open to the sun, but then he saw them, names, dozens, hundreds of them, written, not in ink or carved in stone, but blooming on the petals of flowers. Each blossom bore a single word, delicate and shining, as though it had been whispered into existence. Some names were clear, sharp as morning dew. Others were fading, their letters softening into pale smudges almost lost. He bent to touch one. Mira. The name shimmered, a faint warmth in his fingertips. It was not his memory, not his story, but he felt the echo of someone's love woven into it. Whoever Mira had been, she had mattered, enough for the world to hold her name like this, safe among the petals. The boy, now growing into a man, though still tender at heart, wandered deeper among the blossoms. He noticed that each name had its own color, its own fragrance, its own weight in the air. Some smelled sweet, like honey or wild berries. Others carried the sharp scent of rain or smoke, the breath of storms past. He began to understand. A garden was not planted by human hands. It was tended by memory itself. There was no fence, no keeper, and yet the flowers grew in patterns, as though unseen hands had shaped them into paths. He followed one trail, and it led him to a circle of stones, over which a cluster of blossoms leaned. The names here were softer, nearly gone, fading as though the world had begun to forget them. He knelt and touched one, Elias, and whispered it aloud. The moment he spoke, the petals brightened just slightly, and the fading slowed. His heart tightened. The garden was not only a place of memory, it was a place of rescue. Each name longed to be remembered, if only for a moment. To speak them aloud was to keep them alive. So he began to walk slowly through the rows, reading each name in a voice no louder than the wind. Leora, Jalen, Amara, Tovin. With every word he felt the garden breathe a little deeper. The blossoms trembled, as though sighing with relief. It occurred to him that his stretching gift, the bending of his body, his ability to soften instead of resist, was not just of the flesh, it was of the heart. To speak names was another kind. To stretch, an extension of empathy, reaching toward those who might otherwise vanish. Hours passed. The sun shifted, painting the garden in shades of gold. He lost count of how many names he had spoken, but he felt lighter, as though he had been given something each time he gave. Near evening, he came upon a patch of flowers that startled him. On their petals were names he recognized. His mentor's name bloomed there, steady and warm, not fading but glowing like a lantern in dusk. He touched it gently, his eyes soft with tears that did not fall, and just beside it, his brother's name, clear but quieter, as if it waited for him to return. He sat in the grass, unable to speak for a long while. His chest ached, yet not from sorrow alone. There was gratitude too, a sense that memory itself was kind, that it found ways to root even when human hearts faltered. As twilight deepened, fireflies rose from the edges of the garden, floating like sparks of thought. Their light mingled with the blossoms until the names glowed softly all around him, a field of stars made of remembrance. Before he left, he pressed his palm into the earth. "I will not forget," he whispered, though he knew forgetting was part of being human. Still, the promise mattered. The flowers trembled, as though bowing in response. On the path away from the hollow, he felt the rhythm of the village of sleepwalkers echoing faintly in his mind. The balance they carried between dream and waking now joined with the garden's quiet reminder that to live was not only to remember, but also to tend, to water the fragile blossoms of memory before they faded. That night, as he lay beneath the stars, he whispered a few of the names again into the open air, letting them rise into the sky like prayers. He felt them linger in the darkness, not lost but gathered, and he fell asleep with the strange comfort that he had been part of, holding them, even if just for a little while. He first noticed her laughter before he ever noticed her face. It drifted through the marketplace on a soft afternoon, woven between the sound of coins and footsteps, light as rainfall on summer leaves. It wasn't loud, not the kind of laugh that demanded attention. It was quieter, like water finding its way through cracks, like streams that nourish without anyone asking them to. When he turned, he saw her by a stall of bread, speaking with the baker's child. The boy had offered her a crooked loaf, and she accepted it as though it were gold, her smile bending gently toward the small gift. And then the laughter again, subtle, trickling, a melody that sank into the air and stayed there. He found himself standing still, his own breath slowed as though the moment was meant to be held. She noticed him only later when their paths crossed at the well. He had stretched, almost without thinking, to catch a jug that slipped from an elder's hands. She had been standing nearby, and instead of surprise at his oddness, she only tilted her head, studying him with a look that carried no judgment, only curiosity. "You have soft hands," she said. He blinked, not knowing what she meant. "Not soft from lack of work," she added, "but soft like grass, willing to bend." Her words startled him, for they echoed the very truth of his power. Yet she said it so simply, as though she had long known. He nodded, unable to answer, and she laughed again, the rain sound that had already taken root in his memory. In the weeks that followed, they met often without planning to. She seemed to appear wherever he walked, the riverbank, the garden's edge, the path to the hill. Not as though she followed him, but as though the rhythm of her days was written near his. Each meeting was marked by small exchanges. A shared plum, a story told halfway, a silence that felt safe. Her presence was not grand, not like the heroes in old tales who strode into villages with banners and fire. She was ordinary in the loveliest way, her hair often wine-tangled, her hands carrying baskets of fruit, her clothes simple and marked with soil. But it was her ordinariness that made her extraordinary. She carried her life like one carries a lantern, not to dazzle, but to gently light the path for whoever walked beside her. One evening, beneath the lanterns of the slow-motion festival, they found themselves walking side by side. She looked upward at the glowing lights drifting against the dark sky. "They fall so slowly," she whispered, "as if they want us to remember." He nodded, and then she added, "You stretch to help people. I've seen it. Do you ever stretch for yourself?" The question startled him. He had never thought of it that way. His gift had always been outward, a reaching toward others. He opened his mouth, then closed it, unsure. She touched his hand lightly, the way one might test the rain with open fingers. "You should," she said simply. From then on, her laughter became his compass. He found that when he heard it, something inside him softened, the way soil softens beneath rainfall. He did not need to understand her fully, He only needed to feel the way she made the world gentler by existing in it. There were evenings when they sat by the garden of forgotten names, speaking them together aloud. She would read them as though they were lullabies, and sometimes when the names faded back into silence, she would laugh softly, not out of mockery but like rain falling on thirsty ground. Even memory seemed nourished by her sound. In time, he learned fragments of her story. She had once lived in a village where drought had lasted too long, where silence grew heavier than words. She carried no bitterness when she told it, only acceptance, as though she had chosen to be water where there was none. Perhaps that was why her laughter sounded like rain. It was born from places that needed it most. Their bond was not fiery or urgent. It was not the love sung in ballads of knights and queens. It was gentler, like two rivers running side by side, carrying each other without effort. He found himself bending not just for others, but toward her, toward the quiet shelter she gave, without asking. One night, as they rested beneath the stars, he asked her, "Why do you laugh the way you do?" "As though the world is pouring through you," she smiled, her eyes reflecting the constellations. "Because everything is temporary," she said softly, "and if I don't laugh, the rain inside me might never fall." He did not answer, only reached for her hand. They sat like that for a long time, listening to the crickets, her laughter mingling with the night air. From then on, whenever storms gathered, he no longer feared them. For her laugh had taught him that rain was not always a breaking. It was a blessing, too. The child came as softly as dawn, without thunder or proclamation. One day the house was only theirs, filled with the hush of two voices, and the next it carried the steady breathing of someone new. He remembered the first night, how the baby's eyes opened in the dim glow of a lantern, not crying, not restless, just watching, as though the world was a lullaby being sung for her alone. They named her for a flower that grew even in shadows. It was her mother's idea, a simple name that felt like rain carried in syllables, and from the beginning she was different, not in the way he had been, bending and stretching with a body that seemed made of kindness. No, her gift was quieter, hidden in the spaces between words. She listened. That was her gift. She listened with an intensity so deep it seemed the world leaned toward her to be heard. When neighbors came, speaking of their troubles or joys, the child even at a young age would sit nearby with her head tilted, her gaze steady, her silence vast and tender. People left lighter, as though something unspoken had been received. Her laughter was rare, but when it came, it was like bells under water, distant yet clear. And though he cherished those moments, it was her quiet that taught him the most. He had learned to bend for others, but she showed him the power of stillness, of not moving at all. There was a night when storms shook the house, rattling its wooden bones like an old song. The child sat upright in her bed, eyes wide open but no fear in her face. He sat beside her, stretching his arm around her like a blanket. She leaned into him and whispered, "The sky is only talking loudly." Then she fell back asleep, while the storm raged on. He stayed awake, listening, realizing she had already given him more wisdom than he had given her. Her mother often said, "She doesn't always speak, but she understands." And it was true. The child seemed to carry a knowing that did not come from books or lessons, but from an ancient inward well. When she was older, she would walk with him to the garden of forgotten names. She never asked about the flowers or the murmurs of memory. That grew there. She simply listened, her small fingers brushing petals, her silence forming a prayer that needed no words. Sometimes after a long pause, she would whisper a single name she had overheard, as though returning it to the earth with reverence. One afternoon, as they sat by the river, he stretched a branch to pull down a fruit for her. She did not take it immediately. Instead, she looked at him with that same steady gaze. "You always reach outward," she said softly, "but sometimes you could let things fall into your hands." He was stunned by the clarity of it. From a child's mouth came the wisdom of stillness. He laughed, shaking his head, but her words stayed with him like gentle echoes. Her listening was not only for people. Birds seemed to linger near her, dogs curled by her feet. Even the wind slowed when she stood in the field. There was something in her quiet that welcomed the world as it was, without trying to change it. He wondered often if this was her inheritance, not his stretching, not his bending, but something greater, the ability to receive without resistance, to listen so deeply that the world revealed its hidden softness. As years passed, her bond with her mother grew like vines, wrapping gently around everything they did together. They would bake bread, and though the girl seldom spoke, the laughter of her mother filled the silence, and somehow the child's presence amplified it. It was as if her stillness made joy echo louder. Sometimes, watching them, he felt himself stretch in a different way, not his limbs but his heart. It expanded quietly, making room for love that required no effort, only being. One night, when lanterns swayed in the distance and the air smelled of rain, he found her sitting outside alone. She was staring at the sky. He joined her, waiting for her to speak. Finally, she said, "When you stretch, you remind people that the world can bend. When I listen, I remind them they are not alone." He could not reply. His throat was tight, not with sadness, but with awe. He realized then that legacy was not about repeating the same gifts, but about carrying the same heart. His bending had turned into her stillness, his reaching into her listening, and both were born from kindness. She leaned against him, her small shoulder pressing into his side. "It's enough," she whispered. And in that moment, with crickets singing in the fields and her quiet voice threading through the night, he knew she was right. The map was never made of paper. It was not carved on stone, nor drawn in ink. It was a fleeting thing, sketched by hand on the soft shore where the tide came and went. He began tracing it one late afternoon, when the air was golden and his thoughts were restless. At first it was only idle wandering. His finger dipped into the sand, and lines appeared, curving this way and that, forming rivers, mountains, and winding paths. The child sat beside him, her eyes following each motion. She did not ask where the paths led, nor why he drew them. She simply listened with her gaze, and the silence between them became the first ink of the map. Soon, others noticed. Villagers passing by would stop and watch. Some smiled, some frowned. Some pointed at places and wondered aloud if the map matched any real land. He never said. He only kept drawing, letting his hand move as if guided by something older than thought. The truth was, he did not know where it led, and yet each line felt like a release, a letting go of destinations he had once imagined, a surrender to something softer. When the tide came in, swallowing the lines, he felt no loss. Instead, he felt relief. The world had wiped away his plans, reminding him that nothing drawn in, sand was meant to last. He began to visit the shore often, the child at his side, her quiet presence like a lantern. Together they watched the water smooth the earth again and again, and in time, he came to understand that the map was not about reaching anywhere. It was about remembering that every path, no matter how carefully marked, is always temporary. 1. Evening, as dusk bled into night, he paused with his hand half buried in sand. The child asked softly, "Do you know where it goes?" He shook his head. "I only know that it begins here." She nodded, and without a word, drew a small circle beside his winding lines. "Then we are here," she said. That was enough. He began to love the impermanence, to feel the beauty of maps that did not demand obedience. He thought of his youth, of the bottle of sky, of the swaying house, of the endless sandwich, all gifts that had come not from seeking, but from stumbling, from living. None of them had been destinations. They were moments like shells left on a beach waiting to be found. The villagers, too, began to change. Some returned to the shore not to ask questions, but to sit quietly, watching the lines appear and disappear. The act became less about direction, more about reflection. It was as though the sand reminded them of something they had forgotten, that nothing needed to be held forever to be meaningful. One old man, watching the tide erase a mountain the boy had drawn, whispered, "Even this is enough." The boy, now a man, though he still thought of himself as stretching, still learning, felt those words settle in him. Enough. Yes, that was what the map had been trying to tell him. The child grew taller, her silence deeper. Sometimes she would add her own marks, Small dots for stars, wavy lines for clouds, delicate shapes of flowers. He loved how her hands moved, steady, unhurried, as if she already knew the tide would come, but gave the gift of her lines anyway. Her mother would watch from the distance, smiling with that rain-filled laugh. She never interrupted, never asked for meaning. She too understood that some maps were not for travel, but for presence. Seasons passed, and with them new lines in the sand. The maps became layered with memory, though never preserved, and that, strangely, was their beauty. What was gone remained, only in their hearts, soft and light as whispers. One day, as the horizon swallowed the sun, he lay back on the shore, letting the cool sand cradle his body. The waves whispered their lullaby. The child, now nearly grown, sat beside him, her eyes on the dissolving map. "You never found the end," she said, almost to herself. "No," he replied, his voice soft with a smile. "And I think that was the point." The tide swept closer, brushing his feet. He felt himself stretching, not outward this time, not toward any destination, but inward, toward acceptance. The sand did not resist the water, it welcomed it, and perhaps he too could learn to welcome the tides of change without needing to hold them back. As the night deepened, stars emerged above, scattering their own silent map across the sky. The child looked upward, then back to the sand. For a moment, both maps, the fleeting and the eternal, seemed to mirror each other, and he thought, perhaps all maps are the same. Whether drawn in sand or sky, they are reminders of where we are. Now, and that is always enough. There came a night when the sky forgot its lanterns. The stars, which had always flickered above like small companions, were absent. He stepped outside, expecting the familiar scatter of light, but the heavens were empty, a dark ocean without reflection. The air was heavy, as though carrying a silence too deep for words. He felt it in his chest, a soft weight, not pain, but the ache of absence. The village was quiet, wrapped in that same hush, and the river beyond seemed darker than usual, as though reluctant to move. He stood for a long while, waiting for something to return, but nothing did. No glimmer, no whisper of light, and in that emptiness doubts crept in. Had he lost his way? Had he misunderstood the gifts that had guided him? The stretching, the listening, the small miracles, were they only dreams he had told himself to? Soften the sharp edges of life. He thought of his grandfather's voice carried in the bottle filled with stars. How bright it had once seemed, how full of wonder. He thought of the house that swayed with the wind, teaching him softness. He thought of the endless sandwich, the whispering clouds, the girl who understood him without words. Each memory rose like a lantern in his mind, but here under the empty sky they felt fragile, like paper lights trembling against wind. The child found him sitting at the edge of the garden, staring upward. She was older now, her silence carrying more weight, but her eyes still held the same steady glow. She sat beside him without a word, and after a while she placed her hand in his. "It feels colder without them," she said softly, as though speaking of the stars themselves. He nodded. "I didn't realize how much I depended on their company." Her fingers tightened gently. "They'll return, but even if they don't, we have the bottle." He blinked, startled, and remembered. The old bottle, kept all this time, though often forgotten in a drawer of worn things. He had not touched it in years. Rising slowly, he fetched it, brushing dust from its glass. When he held it up, the faint shimmer inside still flickered, like embers that refused to die. The child leaned close, her eyes wide, reflecting that tiny glow. "See? The stars never leave completely." Her words loosened something in him. He realized then that the stars above had never been the only guide. Their light lived in memories, in voices, in acts of kindness. Even if the sky was dark, the bottle still whispered. The river still listened. The clouds, somewhere, were still, speaking in their drifting language. He set the bottle between them, its faint light casting a small circle around their hands. The night was still starless, but the circle was enough. The woman with the rain-filled laugh joined them later, carrying a blanket. She wrapped it around his shoulders, then the child's. Her presence was steady, like rainfall nourishing dry soil. She did not ask about the missing stars. She only stayed, humming a quiet tune that seemed older than all their memories. Together they sat in the garden, the three of them, watching the small light in the bottle, waiting for nothing in particular. And somehow, the waiting itself became a comfort. As the hours passed, he began to notice other lights. A lantern glowing faintly in a neighbor's window, the fireflies rising timidly from the grass. The moon, pale and shy, lifting itself over the horizon. Perhaps the stars had not vanished after all. They had only scattered themselves differently, reminding him to look closer, softer. When dawn finally arrived, the first light of morning brushed the earth in silver. He closed his eyes and breathed. The weight in his chest loosened, not because the stars had returned, but because he had remembered that darkness itself could be a teacher. The starless night had shown him the truth of impermanence. Even guides fade, even lights dim. And yet, within that emptiness, something gentler waits. A bottle on a shelf, a hand in his, a laugh that sounds like rain. And so he whispered to himself, almost as a prayer, "Even in the dark, we are not alone." The child leaned her head against his shoulder, half asleep. He pulled the blanket tighter around her and looked once more at the empty sky. It no longer felt empty. It felt like a canvas, waiting. The meadow was not far from the village, though it always felt as though it belonged to another world. He had walked there many times in his youth, chasing drifting clouds or lying on his back until the earth itself seemed to rock him into a dream. But now older, slower, with hair touched by silver and hands lined by years, he returned with a different purpose. He wanted to sit where time itself had once paused. It was spring, and the grass swayed like quiet waves, brushing against his legs. As he entered, flowers leaned into the breeze, some opening their faces to the sun, others nodding as though already weary from too much blooming. Insects hummed in a low, steady music, a rhythm that seemed to pulse beneath the world's surface. He lowered himself into the grass, stretching carefully, and let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The meadow received him the way a mother receives a child, without judgment, without expectation. He lay back, looking at the wide sky, the clouds moving like gentle caravans across the blue, and in that stillness, memories returned. He saw the key, boy he had been, clutching a bottle filled with starlight and wonder. He saw the crooked house that swayed like grass, teaching him softness. He saw himself discovering the strange stretch of his limbs, and how each bend was less about strength, and more about kindness, the sandwich that never ended, the clouds that spoke in whispers, the quiet friend whose silence had felt like home, the river that listened, mirroring his own heart. Each memory drifted across his mind like the lanterns of a slow festival, glowing, fading, glowing again. Time did not pass in the meadow. It sat beside him, cross-legged, patient like an old companion. He could almost feel it resting its head on his shoulder, whispering, "This is enough. All of this." The woman with the rain-filled laugh joined him later. She carried no burden, no words for a while, only her presence. She sat beside him, her hand brushing through the tall grass, her eyes following the slow clouds above. When she finally spoke, it was in a voice as soft as the meadow itself. "Do you think we lived it?" "Well," he turned to her, his chest full of quiet, "I don't think well is the word. We lived it gently. And maybe that was better." She smiled, her face glowing in the sun, and leaned her head against his arm. Together they listened to the hum of the meadow, as though the earth itself were breathing. The child, though no longer, so little, came to find them. She carried a book she hadn't written in, but had filled with sketches of names and faces, fragments of listening she had gathered. She didn't speak much, only lay in the grass near them, watching the sky. 3 generations woven by silence, sitting in a meadow where time had folded its wings. He thought then of the brother who had stayed behind, of the mentor whose farewell had been a lullaby of all the souls who had touched his journey and then dissolved back into memory. It did not ache the way it once had. Instead, it felt like a meadow full of flowers, some blooming, some fading, but all belonging. As the day stretched, shadows softened. He closed his eyes and let the sounds blur, the hum of insects, the slow breath of wind, the laughter of his love, the steady presence of his child. All of it melted together, forming something more than memory, something like a promise. He whispered aloud, though he wasn't sure if anyone heard. Kindness does not disappear. It sits down, like time, and waits. The meadow seemed to nod, in agreement. When the sun finally began to descend, the sky brushed itself in gold and the grass leaned toward twilight. He rose slowly, feeling the weight of years and yet a strange lightness in his chest. The meadow would remain, holding their silences, their laughter, their soft confessions. He did not need to carry it all anymore. The meadow carried it for him, and, as they walked back together, his love beside him, his child just ahead, he glanced once more over his shoulder. The meadow swayed, endless and eternal, as though time itself had indeed sat down there and decided never to leave. The road was quiet, worn by countless footsteps, but now almost empty. He had walked it many times, sometimes with purpose, sometimes simply to wander. But tonight it felt different. Tonight the road hummed with a softness he could not name, as though it were preparing a song for him, one he had been hearing his whole life without realizing. The air was cool, carrying the scent of grass that had just been kissed by twilight. The sky overhead was neither day nor night, but a tender in-between, a pale stretch where the first stars were shy to appear and the sun lingered just beneath the horizon. He paused to listen, and in the stillness he thought he could hear it. A lullaby, faint and far away, carried along the edges of the world. It was not a song sung by a voice, but by everything that had accompanied him so far. The house that had swayed like grass whispered its creaking timbers. The endless sandwich rustled like soft bread torn open, shared. The rivers flowing echoed like the breath of sleep. The bottle of stars chimed faintly, reminding him that voices do not vanish, only change their shapes, and through it all, his own heart beat slowly, like a drum keeping rhythm for the lullaby. He continued walking, and with each step, memories surfaced, not as sharp recollections, but as gentle motifs woven into the fabric of the song. The quiet friend who had taught him silence walked beside him in spirit, her presence felt in the pauses between notes. The mentor's farewell returned, like the soft fall of dusk, neither sad nor joyous, simply complete. His brother's absence hummed like a hollow flute, but even that absence had its music. The road curved, and there, waiting for him, was the woman with the laugh like rain. She did not laugh now. Instead, she hummed softly, her voice blending into the lullaby already in the air. It was the same tune she had hummed when the stars had gone missing, steady and reassuring. When she reached his side, she slipped her hand into his and continued walking as though they had never been apart. A little ahead, the child, now taller, her silence ripened into wisdom, waited, turning her face toward them. She carried no lantern, yet her presence glowed. When he reached her, she touched his sleeve and whispered, "The road doesn't end. It only rests." Her words folded themselves into the lullaby as though the road had been waiting for her to say them. He felt tears at the edge of his eyes, not from sorrow but from the sheer gentleness of it all, the realization that the song had always been there, that every kindness, every stretch of empathy, every quiet moment had been leading here. They sat together at the bend in the road, watching as evening deepened. Fireflies rose, their blinking a rhythm that joined the song. The grass swayed, the sky darkened, and in the hush of twilight, he felt the weight of his life settling, not as a burden but as a blanket being tucked around him. The lullaby grew clearer now. He could almost make out words, though they were not words in any human tongue. They were the sounds of clouds drifting, rivers flowing, bread being broken, laughter dissolving into rain. They were the sounds of memory itself, singing back to him. He closed his eyes and listened, and in that listening he realized the lullaby was not meant to guide him forward or backward. It was meant to remind him that every road, no matter how long, eventually becomes soft enough to rest upon. That the end of roads was not an ending at all, but a place where footsteps slowed, where breaths grew steady, where the heart found its quiet rhythm again. He leaned against his love, his child leaning against him, and together they let the song wash over them. No urgency, no destination. Just a lullaby at the end of roads, whispered by a world that had always known how to cradle its travelers. Somewhere he thought he heard his grandfather's voice, carried faintly on the wind, joining the song with the same warmth it once had, "In the bottle of stars." He smiled. The road, the meadow, the sky, all of it, was singing him to rest. And as the lullaby lingered, he thought, if every journey ends with a song like this, then there is nothing to fear. He had always thought of his strange gift as something small, almost ordinary, though the world had often looked at it with wonder. His body could bend, twist, stretch beyond measure, but the true gift had never been in the shape of his limbs. It had been in the gentleness behind it, the way he had learned to bend for others, to adapt without breaking, to soften instead of harden. Now older, he found himself reflecting on what remained. Not every story is carried by strength. Some are carried by tenderness. He sat beneath a willow tree, its branches swaying low like arms that wanted to embrace the earth. The meadow was just beyond, the road behind him, and the river could be heard in the distance, carrying its eternal murmur. The willow reminded him of himself, stretching not upward in rigid defiance, but outward, downward, bending with the wind. The child sat with him, now grown into someone who no longer looked like a child, but still carried the essence of listening. She had never inherited his stretching body, and he was glad for that. She had inherited something quieter, something deeper, the ability to hear what others left unsaid. "Do you ever wish I could do what you did?" she asked one evening, her eyes following the willow's bending arms. He shook his head gently, a small smile on his face. "No. I only ever hoped you would learn what I learned, that bending is not weakness, that softness can hold more than strength ever could." She nodded, as though she already knew, but still wanted to hear him say it. That was her way. She listened to the space between words, but she also understood the comfort of hearing them spoken aloud. And so he told her stories. He told her of the crooked house that had taught him to sway. He told her of the endless sandwich that fed more than stomachs. He told her of the clouds that whispered, the river that listened, the meadow where time had sat down. He told her of his friend of silence, his brother who had stayed behind, his mentor who had left him a farewell. As soft as dusk. She listened, her eyes half closed, her breath slow as though the stories themselves were lullabies. And as he spoke, he realized that the true stretching had always been in the passing of gentleness, from one heart to another. One day, as they walked through the village, a child approached them. She had tripped and scraped her knee, and though tears welled in her eyes, she tried not to cry. His daughter knelt before the little one, not to stretch her body, but to stretch her listening. She spoke softly, so quietly he almost didn't hear, but the words were enough to soothe the child, enough to make her tears ease. In that moment, he understood. The legacy had already passed on. It was not about bending arms or stretching legs. It was about knowing when to yield, when to soften, when to hold space for others. His child had inherited that gift fully, more fully than he ever had. That evening, sitting once more beneath the willow, he whispered into the twilight, "The world teaches us to stand tall, to stay unbroken. But I have learned that it is better to bend, better to sway, better to stretch until what is heavy can pass through without breaking us." The branches seemed to agree, bowing lower, brushing against the earth as if to cradle it. He leaned back, watching the sky shift into night, and thought of the countless ways people misunderstand legacy. Some chase monuments, others build empires, others write their names in stone. But he was content to leave behind something that could not be carved, something that lived in silence, in laughter, in the way a hand could reach for another, without fear. He looked at his daughter and smiled. "Stretching was never about me. It was always about you, about everyone who came close enough to see what gentleness could do." The stars emerged slowly, like old friends, each one blinking, as though stretching its light across the night. He thought then of the bottle from his childhood, glowing with voices, and wondered if perhaps the stars were just that, stretching their voices across the vastness, bending their light so it could reach him here, beneath the willow. And as sleep began to brush at the edges of his thoughts, he felt no need to hold on. The legacy had already taken root. It was in his daughter's listening, in the kindness of neighbors, in the soft way the village bent toward one another without snapping. It was in the very air around him, lingering like a lullaby. The legacy of stretching was not in strength. It was in empathy. It was in the ability to bend without breaking, to give without vanishing, to soften without fading. And somewhere, deep inside, he knew that even when his body could no longer sway, his gentleness would remain, stretching outward, carried by others. The meadow was quiet, holding the weight of twilight as though time itself had slowed to a gentle breath. He lay down among the grass, the earth cool beneath him, the sky still faintly golden where the sun had lingered. His body, once known for its bending and stretching, now moved with slowness, with ease, like a ribbon finally loosening from its knot. He thought of all the places he had been, though they were never far. His life had not been about great distances, but about small moments that opened into eternity. The crooked house that swayed with the wind, the bottle that carried his grandfather's voice, the endless sandwich that fed more than hunger. Each memory folded gently over him like a blanket, each one softer than the last. His child sat beside him, listening as she always had. She no longer needed to ask questions, for she understood without words. The way her hand rested near his was enough, as if she knew this was not a farewell but a continuation. He felt her presence the way one feels the warmth of a fire, even after closing one's eyes. "I'm tired," he whispered, not with sadness, but with the softness of someone who has carried enough. "Then rest," she said, her voice like rain falling on quiet earth. He smiled at that. Rain, laughter, whispers, bread, clouds, everything had always come back to softness. Never strength, never force, just the bending ways of the world, reminding him that gentleness was the only lasting thing. Above them, the stars began to bloom. He thought again of the sky bottle, of voices that traveled in light, of the way the heavens stretched themselves so far just to be seen. Perhaps that was the truest legacy of stretching, not arms or legs, but light itself, bending across time, and space to reach the ones who needed it most. The meadow swayed around him, grass brushing against his skin like a final lullaby. He let his breath deepen, slower now, each inhale lighter than the last. And then he felt it, not an ending, not a closing, but a loosening, as though the boundaries of his body were stretching one last time, softening into the night. His limbs did not resist, his heart did not resist. He was becoming part of something larger, bending into it without fear. The child leaned closer, whispering, "It's all right." And he believed her. In that moment, he stretched, not with effort, not with strain, but with surrender. He stretched into the stars, into the sky, into the quiet song that had carried him all his life. Somewhere the river sighed, somewhere the house creaked with wind, somewhere the bottle still glowed with voices, and somewhere in the heavens a new bend appeared, a quiet arc of light, as if the universe itself had softened to make room for him. The meadow kept its silence. The stars blinked gently, like eyes closing for sleep. The child rested her hand upon the earth, and the earth seemed to hum back, a reassurance that nothing is ever truly gone, only stretched into new shapes. And so, the final nap was not an ending. It was a continuation of softness, a resting of spirit that would ripple outward in every bend of willow, every whisper of cloud, every kindness offered in silence. And with that, he stretched into the stars, not vanishing, but becoming part of the night sky itself. And if you look closely, you may still see him, a little bend in the heavens, a quiet reminder of gentleness. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.